What's up everyone, Conrad Neufeld here, and today we're talking about the July 14th Bank of Canada announcement regarding the key interest rate. We're going to peel back the headlines a little bit and really take a look underneath the hood, because I think a lot of people think of this as a non-story, but I would argue that there's actually more going on than most people would think. Now, if you're watching this, there's a good chance that you already know the basics, that the Bank of Canada issues a press release 8 times a year regarding the key interest rate, whether they're going to decrease it, increase it, or hold it steady. But I think what a lot of people forget to do is hold those rate announcements with the proper context, to not necessarily hold them at face value, but to take them with a grain of salt. If you've been to my channel before and watched my Why the Bank of Canada Will Raise Rates Sooner Than 2023 video, you'll notice I'll be presenting some very similar themes here. And if you're new to my channel and haven't seen that video yet, just like my 300th subscriber Candyman, well then first of all, welcome, but make sure you go check out that video after that. I'll put the link in the description below. Here's the common theme that you're going to find though. What the Bank of Canada says isn't necessarily what the Bank of Canada believes. Now, I'm not saying they're lying or willingly trying to deceive people. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying, though, is that the Bank of Canada has a lot of eyes on them when they're making these decisions. And a lot of other people are making decisions not just based on what the Bank of Canada says, but in how they say it. Now, more than literally any other point in history, the message that the Bank of Canada puts out there is being watched very, very closely. So with that context in mind, the Bank of Canada isn't going to send out a message so cavalier like they're inviting you to their next barbecue. The messages they put out there are highly curated, highly crafted. They need to be. Remember, when they put out a message, they were wanting and hoping the market to behave in a certain way. Think of it a different way, and here's an extreme example. Let's say that the Bank of Canada knew that the world was going to end tomorrow. Would they tell you? Probably not, because all that would happen is there would be a bunch of chaos on the streets. And to that end, that's exactly why the Bank of Canada shouldn't tell people that the world is going to end tomorrow. Because no one has really anything to gain from that chaos. It might actually make things worse. Now, I'm not saying that the world is going to end tomorrow, so you can relax. But I am saying that these reports should be viewed with that context in mind. So what does this recent bank announcement really tell us? Well, it tells us a few things. In their April decision, they announced that they were reducing the bond buying program from $4 billion to $3 billion. And now, just a few short months later, they're announcing that they're reducing it from $3 billion to $2 billion. This is a much faster rate than they were originally intending. But that's a good thing. It means that the economy is coming back on its feet. It means they have enough confidence in the market in order to do this. And when it comes to their inflation talks and how they're presenting those changes to the market, I actually think they're handling that quite brilliantly. I mean, think of it this way. In previous videos, I had mentioned that not only were the upward rate changes necessary, but it was just as equally important to make sure that the Canadian people were eased into them so that they could accept them more easily. I mean, at the start of the year, most people were convinced that the Bank of Canada wasn't going to be changing rates until sometime in 2023. In fact, they were so convinced that when I released my video saying that no, the Bank of Canada was probably going to increase interest rates sometime in 2022, I actually felt like a conspiracy theorist, like the naked old guy holding up the sign in movies saying the end is near. But regardless, through very effective communication on their part, just a few months later, now everybody just accepts it as normal and as fact that rates are probably going to be going up in 2022. That somehow that promise to hold the rate until 2023 that everybody was holding on to as gospel just never existed in the first place. But once again, that's a good thing. Canada has more to lose in the long run by keeping interest rates where they are now than by gradually increasing them. But that's the key part, is a gradual increase. And to do that, they need to increase rates sooner rather than later. But they also need the public not to freak out and the media not to freak out when that event occurs. And so to that end, I think the Bank of Canada has been moderating that fairly well. Another thing that you need to remember is that Canada does not operate in a vacuum. We're not somehow isolated or unaffected by the things and the decisions that are made from the countries down south, or globally for that matter. So we saw headlines like this. And this, but those headlines could have said something entirely different. Back in April, when the Bank of Canada made their announcement, they indicated that they were expecting Canada's GDP to grow by about 6.5% in 2021, and then leveling off at 3.75% for 2022. But once again, that context is important, because in that same report, they went on to say that the global GDP was to be 6.75% in 2021, basically outperforming Canada by 25 basis points. But that Canada would start to outperform the global GDP the following year because the global markets were only expected to gain 3.5% in 2022. But those numbers changed. And in the most recent report, as more data comes in, they actually think now that the global GDP is supposed to be even better than they originally predicted, reaching a growth of 7% in 2021 and 4.5% in 2022. Conversely, Canada is supposed to underperform this year and only reach 6%, 100 basis points lower than the global average. And now, instead of outperforming the global GDP in 2022, Canada is actually just supposed to fare averagely. Now, some of the articles that you read out there might even go so far to suggest that this cut in the growth that Canada is supposed to experience is a great thing because it's going to hedge against inflation. But the truth is that's not the case. Canada, from a financial perspective, is underperforming and honestly, probably financially mismanaged. And that actually goes on to make our problems worse. And that's really no good for us if this inflationary pressures continue to persist. Inflation is usually only ever a problem when it's substantial, meaning it's significant enough to actually cause a problem, and persistent, that it lasts long enough to wreak that havoc on the market. So what does the Bank of Canada say about inflation? Well, back in April, they said not to worry because inflation in 2021 was going to top off at the higher end of their 1% to 3% range and then ease back to 2% to finish the year off. Well, they aren't saying that now. Inflation actually broke the 3% mark and jumped to 3.6% in May, going higher than they thought it would. And now they're saying it's likely to stay above that 3% mark for the rest of the year now, which is above their acceptable range. But we're not supposed to worry. That break that they've forecasted, well, that's actually going to come in 2022 now rather than in 2021. Except, what if that break from inflation doesn't come? And I honestly have my doubts that it will. In my budget review video that I made titled What the Federal Budget Got Right and What They Got Wrong, I actually alluded to this already. There is a substantial amount of money that's been printed and that is floating around in the markets. And it's got to go somewhere. That's the very definition of inflation. The biggest problem with inflation is that it's much easier to measure it than it is to predict it. And it's not all that easy to measure it either. For starters, inflation doesn't show up equally in the same time or even in the same place. It might show up in food and gas and housing, for instance, before it even starts showing itself in other places. On top of that, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is a lagging indicator. We can't report on inflation until it's actually happened, because the CPI can only account for it once the inflation has actually occurred. This unfortunately means that Canadians will feel the severity of the inflation in their wallets long before that they would ever read it in a news article. And if this inflation doesn't come down, if it stays as high as it is, and if it stays as persistent as it is, then we might not only see a rate increase in 2022, but we might also see a second. In fact, we might even see a third in 2023.